But I must always begin with the initial aha moment, because when you hear it, then you will understand why this makes some sense. I was waiting to speak in Detroit in a conference, not for the first time, and by that time I had been to Detroit so often that I didn't want a tour of Detroit. You know, it's called the pornography of ruins. It's actually thrilling to see the collapse of a civilization, and they've made quite an industry of it. In fact, I've done it sometimes with people whose lives were destroyed along with the destruction of Detroit. And they will give you the tour that says, this is where I used to live, and it's a blank lot. This is where I went to high school, and it's a ruin. You know, this is where I was married, and the church is boarded up. And it's this kind of incredibly negative vibe that is in Detroit. And this time, a younger person saw me outside and said, I'll take you on a tour. And I said, no, I've done it. He says, no, I'd like to. And I had nothing better to do. And they took me to a completely alternate tour of 3 to 4 hours. His name was Mark Nikita, and it was one of the most exciting mornings I ever had in my life. And while Detroit is an ocean of ruin, there's an archipelago of excitement that you don't necessarily find by yourself, of incredible things going on. And I saw houses being renovated, I saw art projects on the street, restaurants being opened, you know, printing presses, just an enormous number of things that were being done by young people that were actually, is not something you see anymore. And the result of this excitement of these restaurants, which by the way, don't have the permits, but nevertheless I ate in, it was delicious and I didn't die or get sick. There were people renovating houses and moving in beautifully done that were doing it themselves, in fact, without the papers, without the architects, etc. And what I was observing is the phenomena. We all know that Detroit can't afford policemen and they can't afford their streetlights. They also can't afford regulators. So people aren't telling the young people to know. And the threshold or the hurdle for starting a business or for renovating a business was actually very, very low. And so the people, the really cool kids that actually had been backed out of Detroit, backed out of Brooklyn, and out of San Francisco, and all the places they couldn't afford, as so often happens with that generation, they were actually coming in, and actually the word was that Detroit was the next coolest city. And that happens very, very quickly. Now, one of the things that you go there, and if you don't find a young person to give you a tour, you will find a developer called Gilbert, who is well known for buying the high-rises. I don't know what his first name is, but do you know? Dan Gilbert. He's well known for buying the old high-rises, renovating them, and filling them with companies that provide the jobs. And I asked, how does he recruit companies to Detroit? He shows them the young people on the street and says, your workforce is already here. Now, this is the exact reversal of what most cities do. They say we must subsidize the jobs to come here because we need the young people to come back. And of course, the companies need the subsidy to bring the young people back. But what if the young people were there first so that the companies say, here they are, they're already here, they have initiative, they're incredibly skillful, and they're living on a very low cost basis. Therefore, you can afford to hire first-rate talent for actually bargain prices. And that's actually what was happening in Detroit. So I looked at it, and I realized that this phenomena was the natural, organic phenomena by which cities have risen from their bad times. That is exactly what happened in Soho. You know, the people who have an eye, the people who have the courage come in and they fix the buildings. First, without permits, they make the buildings cool. They make the place cool. And once the place is cool, then the proper developers come in, and the proper developers, by that time the real estate value is sufficiently high that the proper developers can come in and do it properly. And then finally, as they say, come the dentist from New Jersey, it's ruined, the prices come up, and people have to go and find the next cool place. And in my lifetime, not only did I witness that in Soho, but I actually saw it in Key West, and I saw it in Palm Beach, in Miami Beach, and many of you have actually seen it happen organically. Now, this doesn't happen anymore. Now, there's a new phenomena called the public-private partnership. Now, that didn't exist, when I started practicing. I don't remember when it started, but it was very recently that everybody comes in and says, I need a public-private partnership. And I said, why do you need a public-private partnership? Doesn't real estate generate value? Wasn't America colonized with 30 million penniless immigrants without any help whatsoever? What's up with development that it now needs subsidy? And the reason is that as the regulatory environment arose like the tide, it actually requires a huge investment to get a permit when the value actually isn't there. So you have a city that has relatively low value, and it's very expensive to do it properly, both procedurally and in terms of compliance to the code. And so because the profit isn't there, this process needs to be subsidized. So the government, by creating a process of overregulation, has actually had to step in and provide the relief from the problem they have caused in the first place. And I said, aha, I understand that now, why this all happened. By the way, it happened slowly on my watch. Everybody here on our watch. And then I remembered that in 1970, when I was with Arquitectónica, 27 years old, we were building high-rises. And the code was this thick. The Miami code was this thick. And then when Seaside was designed in 1980, and we drew it all up, and we just did it right. We didn't know. We drew the streets narrow and the setbacks short, and we did the footings the way we want. And nobody stopped us because there were no regulators. There was actually literally nobody to submit to. It was rural America. And what Detroit reminded me of is what it was like to be young and be able to do very significant projects, and how completely that has disappeared from the United States, so that now the young developers, the young entrepreneurs actually are essentially working for very large firms or inventing tactical urbanism. And one of the great and most exciting things that you will hear today and you'll hear in the next couple of years is tactical urbanism, which is a way by which people actually are beginning to do things while still very young. So to be very careful, how do we position lean urbanism relative to the CNU and relative to tactical urbanism? But here we are, lean urbanism. There is Detroit, which is a place of fantastic opportunity. And then there are these three movements. Now let's talk about the new urbanism. What happened to new urbanism? It's 24, 25 years old. We have grown up and grown old. A lot of white hairs in this room. And one of the nice things about being a white hair is that when you pick up a phone, somebody on the other side actually answers, including in Washington. In fact, some of us have become very high-level functionaries in Washingtons and in state government, et cetera. And as a consequence, the new urbanism is taking up increasingly important agendas of reform. Really grown-up stuff that really matters. And you saw Chris Lineberger presenting today. It really matters, and it's very long-term. And we, who grew up in this regime of bureaucracy, are able to deal with it. Remember, we grew with this regime of extraordinary regulation, and so the older folk are conversant with it. Tactical urbanism are the kids who didn't. And in my office, and one of the young people, when I hand them the current Miami Code, which is now 2 volumes, they actually go, meh. They won't read it. They just won't read the code. They won't read it, and if they pretend to read it, I can't trust them that they've read it. And I understand perfectly, because I wouldn't have read it. It's incredibly oppressive and senseless, and if they're made to read it, they drop out of architecture because that's not what they signed up to do. It really is. So we have a relationship that's very interesting, which is that while at the same time that the kids are showing me how to operate my computer, because when I engaged in computers, it was too late for me to become really an expert on it. But they grew up with it. They grew up with the complexity of the computer, so they're experts. It's exactly analogous to us growing up with the complexity of the regulation. And in the same way that the young people help me with the internet and the discussion in a kind of way that will be forever unattainable to me, I can help them in understanding regulatory processes in a way that will always be unattainable to them. And so we have a kind of symbiotic relationship, you know. And one of the things that Lean Urbanism, one of the ways to think about Lean Urbanism is actually preparing the field by the first generation new urbanists to hand over the reins to the next generation in a condition akin to that in which we were young and able to operate while still young. Because at the moment, they can't operate. So what they did is they brilliantly invented tactical urbanism. Tactical urbanism is a way of getting things done against the reality of regulation, bureaucracy, the whole list of things that prevent people from doing. You know what it takes to install a crosswalk? Oh, I mean, it's amazing. You need a major traffic engineer, a campaign of half a year. So you paint it with, you know, water-based paint. No one is killed, everybody's happy, and they've done a demonstration project. Famously, they did that in New York, putting chairs where the traffic was not circulating, and it turns out that cafes could happen out there. They build skating parks where people aren't killed, and so it's okay to do it, and so forth. And it is absolutely brilliant tactical urbanism. The only problem is that you get people of incredible skills, you know, Mike Lydon and all his friends, that are doing projects that essentially, eventually, are beneath them, right? There's only so much you can do in terms of demonstrating a cafe and so forth. People of that skill set should be doing whole towns. But we have permitted a world to occur where they can't do that. So lean urbanism in some ways is the next generation. Of course, the young people will always go through tactical urbanism. Lean urbanism is the next stage where you can do permitted projects. By the way, these are not, lean urbanism projects are not unsanctioned. You get the permits. But they're small, and they can be done by people who are still very young, very small, and let us not forget immigrants. Anybody who's lived in Miami knows that the immigrants that arrive in this country know how to build. In fact, they're building America. But the regulatory, in fact, these were the immigrants that built America in the 19th century. The regulatory environment now makes them employees of very, very large housing companies. But at night, we all know in Miami, they're building stuff under the radar. So we want to enable these people who are working anyway to do smaller projects, okay? And there's an agenda that involves quite a lot of things that will be read out later, including lean farming, lean infrastructure, actually this is out of date, but there'll be lean education, et cetera. There are 8 platforms of lean. And not least education, you may know, or you may have noticed, that actually architectural education is exceedingly expensive and it doesn't actually teach you anything that's necessarily useful. So there is an agenda there of that type. So when we were actually defining lean urbanism, we were very concerned to not pile on. One of the aspects of lean is we do not do anything that anybody else is doing because that's not lean. So there's always pressure to do a green agenda, and we always pull back from it because we say, no, there are lots of people already doing a green agenda. So we created something called the lean seam. Again, the lean seam does not pile on to whatever the new urbanism is doing, and it does not pile on to whatever tactical urbanism is doing. It is actually the residue between 2 operations that have emerged out of the new urbanism. You know, and one is a step to the next, and of course there's overlap, but we're very careful, particularly not to actually step on the wonderful work that the younger tactical urbanism is doing. That would be actually quite grotesque to do that. You know, they've got the thing going. So this is called the lean seam. And a lot of the discussion that Brian spoke about is, you know, basically some of us, principally me, policing the thing and saying that's not in the lean seam. People are doing that already. That's being done, you know, not our job. So that's the lean seam. Now, what happens when you look at the new urbanism, lean urbanism, is that the models that we look at actually changed slightly. And for example, 1874, which is not a period that anyone in the New Urbanism particularly mentions, we much prefer the 1920s, developments, like Coral Gables and Shaker Heights and so forth. But 1874 was a fascinating period. This was the multi-decade period where 30 million immigrants were actually housed. And you get people, by the way, virtually every state had an enormous book like that, full of the most extraordinary number of towns and houses and buildings and people and cattle. Everybody got a portrait, the famous cow, the famous mayor, the famous house, everybody. It was an incredible performance. And the states, about 1870, had a book like that. This happens to be Iowa. When you look at 1870, just one paradigmatic phenomena stands out. Brigham Young went west without a penny, and between 1855 and 1900, founded 730 towns and cities, not one of which failed. Okay? Not even the British Empire has that performance. Not even Levittown has that performance. It was an astounding performance. And there was a protocol that was developed that was actually this pragmatically intelligent, and among the lessons that it teaches is you do successional work. For example, a lesson that he would do is he would send out people that actually knew about land. So they would find a site in which food actually grew. It wasn't random. And they'd come back and they would know the production of the land. And so the block that was to be designed to house 10 families was actually sized relative to the fertility. And of course, there was a stream. And a date certain, date certain because you had to arrive at the earliest time that the freeze was over and actually finish the first housing by the winter. And it's a merciless climate, the Southwest. And he would assemble a society, and the society involved men and women, school teachers, people who repaired shoes, people who knew how to farm, people who knew how to make a box. A society that actually was symbiotic and necessary, as opposed to the standard American colonial model, which was 60 miners and 4 prostitutes. Okay, random, the market is operating here. And that is why you have an enormous amount of ghost towns in the West. Failure all over the place. Those of you who work in the West will know that actually you find desert that has platted towns on it. There's no record whatsoever except the plat of a town. And that's because there was planning, there was intelligence. Then you arrived with this society, and the first day you dammed the stream and you planted the potato crop. The next day you selected the location of the temple and you knew the size of your grid, which you laid north, south, east, west, and the surveyors went out, and when the plat came in, the plat with the drawing on it, it was cut up with scissors and put in a bowl, and you pulled out your little chit, which was your lot, and what you pulled out was your deed. Get it? Unbelievable. Piece of paper works 3 times. And it was that, and then you had to complete a sod house by the first winter, a wooden house by the 5th year, and a brick house by the 10th year. Successional. Okay. Totally logical, totally cool, but a lot of tools that we have completely forgotten. And we'll never go back to that, but it's really healthy to actually know that it's in our blood and in our culture to do that. And you see these wonderful towns at year 10 and year 20, ready to go with tremendous ambition like that, and always successional. Successional being a very important part of the Lean ethos. Coral Gables, for example, where I'm from, what it was like at year 4, okay? What it was like at year 4, and the idea that you actually began with a town center that was 1 story. Our Miracle Mile was 1 story. What did the New Urbanism become in the last years of the 20th century up to 2007? We always pitched instead of the inaugural condition of the inexpensive single story, we pitched the climax condition. From the beginning, we built a minimum of 4-story town centers. No new urbanist in this room, before 2007 drew anything less than a 4-story mixed-use town center. Well, it turns out that 100 feet of town center is $15 million. So you need $15 million every time to build your town center, which means the entire first generation that grew up in a new urbanist town didn't have a town center. And then we remembered that actually, in the good old days of Seaside and Alice Beach, and Rosemary Beach, we began with temporary first-story structures. I mean, so the same firm that always instinctively built the single-story structure so that the people from the beginning could have a town center completely forgot in the madness of the late 20th century, and we built 4-story town centers, which actually became unbuildable, and many of them were not built. And so lean urbanism at the level of how even the new urbanists operate is very salutary. And one of the tools is you don't start with this. By the way, this is an iconic new urbanist. This is Meisner Park, an absolutely iconic new urban. Didn't we love this? You know, try that today. And of course, you remember Seaside beginning that way. You know, very, 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 very lean. So we have to remember the new urbanist origins, but also the origins of American urbanism in the first place. Now, I made this slide because it's so important to realize this, okay? The development process prior to 1980 was the first phase, and these are terms come up that Todd Zimmerman and Lori Vogt came up with, was pioneered by the risk oblivious. It's the risk oblivious market. They take risks, they put in, they work, they don't, you know, they literally financial and physical risks, and often security risks to go in. And the risk oblivious, the bohemians come in, and the lousy little Italian market becomes a cool little Italian market. And the empty loft becomes a very cool loft. Then it is followed later by the second phase, which are the risk aware, the developers. Now the developers get the permits, they sell properly, they get the professionals, all the things that are necessary. But by that time, in order to put that investment in, you need to have the real estate value to be high. And then finally, as we know, you get the dentist from New Jersey, which is what ruins all real estate, all cool places in New York, and everybody clears out. So what happened? This is the development process prior to 1980. We all saw it. By the way, as far back as the left bank of Paris in 1870, this is what happened. It was the artist first, the developer second, etc. And then this is what happened. We eliminated the first guy. Okay, so when the first guy, the risk oblivious, all of these happen simultaneously. The regulator comes in, forces the existence of the proper developer that sells directly to the dentist from New Jersey, because of course the regular, you know, really cool bohemians can't work. And so government has to come in to fund everybody. That's our problem. And as you know, we're running out of problem. The second thing is, these are the guys that are building America. They're incredibly skillful. They come from countries where there are no developers. You know, our Latin American immigrants know how to build. They all know how to build. And we need to enable them. They are part of the solution to the real estate crisis of affordability. And instead of having them go to huge companies that have a standing and profits in Wall Street, the Lean Urbanism initiative would like to enable them by the thousand to build and make a living on, let's say, 6, 5, 4, 3 houses a year. You know, that would be so marvelous for the revival of our dead smaller towns and the places that are not understood. As somebody said to me, you know, we have a $30,000 grant. And we asked a restaurateur to open a restaurant in Mobile, Alabama. He says, I can't get out of bed for $30,000. Okay? So then we went to the young people, and they said, for $30,000, I can open 3 restaurants. So you get this tremendous multiplier effect with the young, because they're not carrying debt, and they're full of energy and family and collective endeavor. Very powerful. And then, of course, there are the associations of which the older folk more and more will actually begin, we hope, putting small societies for themselves. The American retirees, it looks like they're going to retire in cohorts of interest. You know, the pilots from Delta, you know, the new urbanists. I mean, who wants to listen to the old stories unless our buddies? So instead of being bored to death there's nothing unusual about golfers and skiers and so forth. People do that. But the idea that the most intelligent single idea for American retirement of the baby boomers is actually the common interest community. Like, let's go to a place where we went to college and actually go back to class and finally get the master's degrees, or perhaps give back and teach. You know, so you get Purdue to actually build a self-interest community. That kind of thing, we have to enable the smaller groups to do this. Now, we have a series of cutting tools. One of them is subsidiarity, which is decisions made at certain levels. Now, we're not going to ask young people to decide where the power lines go. Okay, we know that, or even where the schools go. But there's a series of decisions of which they're very capable of making. And the Lean Urbanism project is becoming very, I think, adept at understanding that there are different levels of governance and different issues, and that you can make the decision intelligently. The theory of subsidiarity is that a decision should be made at the most local level that can competently make it at the last possible time. So for example, what a planner does is not decide. For example, a lean urbanism plan doesn't decide what to do, it decides who is to decide and when. And you basically downstream the decision so that people can make the decision when the time comes and not earlier. And that makes it smaller and more local. Now, it is well within the new urbanism, okay, for example, this is a protocol of how that would work. You know, when a decision has to be made, who reports to whom and who has recourse. This includes a system so that if you're unhappy by the decision that has been made, at the next highest subsidiary level, you have recourse at 2 levels higher. And we've learned how bureaucrats that don't want to take risks can actually be safeguarded from the risk. And of course, the transect is all important. You don't do at T6. You're not working downtown at high rises. You're not working at even townhouses. And I think that you will see John Anderson actually saying there's a series of building types that are underneath the thresholds that allow people to build themselves without causing risk. And the models that come up are studies of Portland from 1870, and of course the successional urbanism, in which you begin, as the Mormons did, with natural country, and gradually you actually conceive of an urbanism that can grow and mature. It fits within the charter of the new urbanism, you know, because people are saying, yeah, but what is the ethic of this? What is the ethic of lean urbanism? Is it all about just enabling people that because they're more clever and have more energy will oppress others and we'll get the slums of the 19th century again? I mean, will it not end that way? And we say, no, we will embed it into the charter, and these aspects of the charter actually pertain to the range of the lean urbanism. And of course, so this becomes, out of the charter of the new urbanism comes what would be the charter of lean urbanism. There's a lot to talk about. We have a lot of people here who've thought about it, and like so many of the endeavors of new urbanism, it's very disaggregated. There are people here I only just met a minute ago, and but we're all, as usual, going in the same direction. So those will be the speakers of the day.